So this is a constant debate you see out there. You see these people that interview people on the street, and they go into liberal areas and they cut out all the smart answers and only show you the really dumb answers, right? And obviously you see that a lot with the left as well, where they go interview people at like MAGA rallies, and you get the dumbest people, but they edit out, any smart responses. And so this is their example. These are all anecdotal examples, which I hate anecdotal evidence in most cases, because one like story or anecdote or even 20 isn't enough to tell a picture for millions of people. So I went through a ton of research papers trying to come up with an answer for this question. Is one side actually smarter than the other? And of course, before we get into that, we got to kind of talk about what is intelligence, right? And intelligence is something I think that is hard to measure. I think the IQ test has been the thing that's been used historically, and that's what we're going to look at mostly because that's what has been used. But, there's flaws with the IQ test in the methodology and things like that, right? It's not a perfect representation of intelligence by any means. And then also I think there's a difference between intelligence and knowledge. So a lot of times these anecdotal videos out there are like interviewing people and asking them who the vice president is, and they can't answer it, things like that, right? That's more knowledge than intelligence, although intelligence is maybe part of that. But this is kind of an okay example of like the difference between the two, although I would disagree that you cannot nurture intelligence, because I'm going to show you in the next thing here that IQ based on degree level does change. Now, is this simply that you have to have a 125 IQ before you could receive a PhD, or in the process of your education, do you move your IQ up to that level? Obviously, I don't know the answer to that, and I think that would be hard to figure out, right? But I do think this is potentially an example that you could nurture your IQ to be higher. Now, again, IQ, is it a perfect measurement? Of course not. Now, before we get into like the IQ-based studies, there was a study here done on brain structure using MRI machines, right? And they found that greater liberalism was associated with increased gray matter in the anterior cingulate cortex. Conservatism increased volume of the right amygdala. What are these? The cingulate cortex has been implicated in several cognitive functions such as empathy, impulse control, emotion, and decision making. Whereas the amygdala is the small almond-shaped thing in the center of your brain, and they kind of call it the monkey brain. It's your flight or fight response. It's theorized that the amygdala was kind of the first part of the brain, and then the rest evolved around it. So in general, like conservatives might respond to fear-based things more. And there's also a lot of studies I looked at that showed that's the case. But that doesn't necessarily mean intelligence is higher on one side or the other. You can't, judge intelligence based off of brain scans, obviously. I just wanted to share that because it's one of the things I found kind of interesting. There is structural differences in the brain based on political ideology, which to me, that's kind of interesting. When I was reading all these research reports, I tried to find like meta-analysis type research reports whenever I could, because what these are is they combine many different research studies, because obviously a research study can be biased, or it can maybe be done in a way that's not incredibly scientific, doesn't have great sample size and things like that, right? I tried to look at as many of those as I could. There isn't a tremendous amount of actual meta-analysis out there on this subject, surprisingly. But here's one. This is a meta-analysis, cognitive ability and economic ideology. So not like pure conservatism versus liberalism. It's actually conservative economics versus liberal economic viewpoints. Now, if you go down here, of course, here's all the studies that they've looked at, and looked at a bunch of different studies, right, to combine all this data. And this is the interesting chart to me. Like all these studies, if you take the average, there is a slight conservative lean in terms of if you have more conservative fiscal views, you are slightly more intelligent, but it is like very slight, right? It's not a huge difference. And that's in general what I have found. I have found like through reading like probably 20 different research reports and just Google searches and all sorts of different things that there really isn't data that to suggest that one side is actually smarter than the other. There's some data like this is pretty good sample size, obviously, because you're combining all these data sets, right? There's some data that supports a conservative lean on IQ, some that supports a liberal lean on IQ, but I couldn't find hardly any that had like a strong lean one way or the other in terms of IQ. And when you're talking like 3 to 5 IQ points, that's pretty trivial. 10 points or higher is when it starts to actually kind of matter. And most of the studies I found, it was like 3 to 5 points, right? This is another study. Obviously, this one I couldn't read because it's not like publicly available. It's an Israeli guy here that's talking about when you control for socioeconomic status and race, there are very few associations between the two. And he was comparing this to the Carl study, which is a study by Oxford that you'll often see cited by Republicans as proof that Republicans are smarter, because in Carl's study, he did show that with his methodology and however he came to his conclusions, that conservatives are slightly smarter, like 3 to 5 IQ points. So again, that's the one that they reference all the time because it supports their views. But I found plenty of studies that also say 3 to 5 liberal, So I found this study interesting. Now, this study here, if you go to the top here, this is a German, somebody from Brazil and Dominica, right? So it's a foreign study. It's not U.S. based per se. However, it does show that the reality is if you're a centrist, which I view myself as a centrist, maybe a little bit center left, although I have quite a few right-leaning views. Some of my views are very, very conservative. So, but in general, I view myself as center to maybe center left, like somewhere in there, right? Good news for us centrists, which seem to not be very many people these days, but we are the smartest when you compare them to the people that are firmly on one side or the other. It's fairly significant. You're talking about close to 10 points difference, right? Now, if you're center right versus the lowest ranking right, that's obviously a solid 10 points difference, and that becomes significant, right? So in general, centrists are smarter. I think it's fair to say that. When you look at left versus right, you're talking like, again, standard thing that I've seen, 2 to 3 IQ points difference, right? And this is using like data outside the US, but in this case, it's the same thing. Like there is not a strong correlation between political party and IQ is always used. So that's why I'm using it. I know IQ is not perfect. So this whole idea of like interviewing idiots on the street, like it's pointless. It doesn't add anything to the dialogue. There's no evidence that one side or the other is actually smarter. Now, if you want to talk about education level or the knowledge part that I was talking about earlier, there is a pretty big divide. So those with at least a high school degree, 47 to 37 Dem to Republican. Those with some college, 47 to 42 Dem to Republican. College graduates, this is where it really starts to divide. 52% of college graduates are Democrat versus 40% of Republicans. Now, this comes from Pew Research, which I've talked about in the past. They are one of the most reliable organizations out there. Very centrist in terms of their views. They don't lean left or right. Now, people on the right are going to claim they do. That's not true. Now, if you get to postgraduate, then you really see a divide. 56% of the Democrats have postgraduate experience, whereas 36% of Republicans do. So in terms of education, like Democrats have a clear advantage there. And again, I'm centrist. I don't have a dog in the fight necessarily. I do lean slightly left. I would say, overall, like maybe 55% of issues, I lean left versus 45% conservative, like somewhere that's kind of my balance, I would say. And then I know the Republicans are also going to say that it's the indoctrination of the colleges that are doing this. And I think to some degree that is correct. I think there is liberal ideology that is pushed on college campuses and certainly even in K through 12 to some extent. However, what I would argue is like when I was younger, going through K through 12 and even in college, the early days of college for me, we were taught a very conservative view of history that people like Christopher Columbus were great people, right? And then as it turns out, he's not. Like he was quite a bad person that killed a lot of innocent people. Same with the founding fathers. We were taught this view that they're perfect. They were far from perfect. Some of them were great people and some of them not so much. But we were taught that they were all great. So it was kind of a whitewashed version of history where we kind of skip over the bad parts and only tell you the good parts, which is kind of the conservative view of wanting to have how we teach history, that of American exceptionalism at all points in history. That's kind of what they want to push. And the reality is that hasn't always been the case. We have a lot of flaws throughout our history, right? To wrap it all up, at the end of the day, no clear difference in intelligence, some differences in education level. That's about it. People are going to be mad either way, but that's the reality. You can do your own research. If you find something that disproves anything I said, let me know in the comments. With that, guys, see you in the next video.